My name is Dr. Kate Watson, and I'd like to introduce you to a topic that will be revisited in most of your courses at Pierce College. We're going to focus for a few moments on what is considered person-first language. This is the type of language that honors that people are more than their diagnoses and misfortune. They are people first and foremost. So as we go through this presentation, we will be asking you to consider the way that you speak about people and consider also that we are more than just what has happened to us in our lives. Here's some examples of person-first language. So rather than describing someone, for example, as a criminal, you might describe them as a person first. And there you might say, this is a person who has committed a crime. Rather than calling someone an alcoholic, you might describe them as a person who has an addiction to alcohol. The list here goes on. I'll give you a few seconds to check over this list and see what you notice about the language. Let's talk about where things might differ just a little bit. Sometimes we describe people by the identity groups that they belong to. Now, this is different than describing someone based on some misfortune that they've had or a diagnosis that they're struggling with. Identity groups are not negative, they're not bad. There really is nothing wrong with belonging to an identity group. Oftentimes, this is something that people do want to promote as an important part of who they are. Now, I will say we could still be more thoughtful about how we use those terms. So rather than describing an entire group of people, for example, as gays, we might say they are gay people. Rather than blacks, we might talk about black people or African American people. The same would be true with religious identities, gender identities, sexual orientation, age, etc. No one is saying that we should ignore these groups or pretend they don't exist. Quite the opposite. Identity groups are something to embrace, promote, and be proud of. We can still, however, speak about them as people, not just some vague group. Is there more to know? The answer here is always. I also thought I might take the opportunity to bring up some other terminology that is considered either offensive, outdated, derogatory in some way, or maybe just unnecessarily negative. So for example, the first one on this list says illegals. This is something that you will see in some media outlets, although not all media outlets. Sometimes we describe people who've come to our country without documentation as illegals, and there is a strong push against this now because it doesn't seem right to describe any human being as illegal. A person cannot be illegal. Something that they have done may be illegal, so there you might describe them as a person who has come to the country illegally, but they themselves are not an illegal. A person is not illegal. So here we're asking you to embrace phrases like undocumented immigrant. You will see in some circles, people are straying away from words like victim to describe someone who's been exposed to violence or abuse. And sometimes you'll see a stronger embrace of survivors. This does really depend on the field that you work in. In the criminal justice system, you definitely still hear an emphasis on victims. And in the human services and healthcare fields, you tend to hear more an emphasis on survivors. Some other words are just considered outdated, like retarded instead of describing people who have intellectual disabilities, lame rather than describing people who have physical disabilities. Midget is a word we do not use to describe people of short stature. We lean on words like little person. Also, one that maybe is just overly negative is describing someone as a worker, like the workers in my office will say this or that. We're moving away from that term in this decade and maybe the past few decades, and now we describe people as employees, staff people, etc. So, one common criticism of person first language is that it's just so wordy and it's lengthy and it's difficult to get out. It's not concise. I can't just say it quickly. Yeah, that may be true. I also feel like it's a small price to pay to offer someone some more dignity and less stigma. So, does it ask me to use more words? Very often. And am I okay with that? Yes, I am. Are there exceptions to the rules? Always. And I would just say do the best you can. Sometimes you will hear some language that does not sound person first, and it is widely accepted, and no one seems to be offended or bothered by it. And you might scratch your head and wonder, well, how come that one's okay? You know what? We're all just trying to do the best we can. I'd like to just end on the idea that words really do matter. You will notice that some of the textbooks you use, the articles you read, and even your instructors will mess this up from time to time because they too are human. We are all doing the best we can to offer people as much dignity as possible, but these mistakes will happen less and less with practice. In many cases, the words you use will send a message about your values and they speak to who you are. So I encourage you to speak wisely and well. And the last thing I will say is when you are tempted to correct people for the way that they may describe themselves, please slow down and at least hesitate in that moment because it is not up to me how other people decide to refer to their group they belong to or what they'd like to be called. I may not always agree with the words people use to describe themselves, and that is okay. It is everyone's right to decide that for themselves.